Good afternoon, Miss Robertson here. Just wanted to read a book with you real quick. This is called Honey, the Dog Who Saved Abe Lincoln, so Abraham Lincoln, and it was written by Sherry Swanson, illustrated by Chuck Grunick. And I just wanted to share this with you. It is a biography about when he was a little boy and his puppy dog. And this is such a great book. Okay, there he is. Young Abraham Lincoln was kneeling deep in the woods when 3 shrill blasts of a whistle cut through the quiet. His corn was ready at the mill and he was late. Watching a frog limp away into the brush, Abe smiled. It wasn't every day he was able to rescue a frog right out of a snake's mouth. So he is supposed to be somewhere, but he decided to go into the woods and found a snake with a frog in its mouth, and you can tell right here he rescued the little frog. Abe hurried back to where Mr. John Hodgson, the miller, was waiting. "Now, Abe, what took you so long this time?" Mr. John asked. "I just can't move along fast like some boys, Mr. John, because I see so many little foolish things that make me stop. I can't help it to save my life." Mr. John patted the boy's head and handed him a sack of ground corn. "Now get on your way, Abe. You'd best be home before dark." So they used to take their corn to the miller, and the miller would grind it up for them. And then when he was done, he would blow a whistle to let you know it's finished. But Abe was always late picking it up. Abe heaved the bag onto his shoulder and set off on the long path that wound its way like a rusty snake through the Knob Creek Hills to Lincoln's log cabin. So now he's off, headed home. Abe had only a mile or so left to go when something caught his attention. He froze. What was rustling in the bushes? He hears something. He's going in the woods to see what it is. See, he should stay on the path to home, but of course he hears something and has to go into the woods. Beneath some branches at the base of a cliff, Abe found a dog whimpering softly. The dog's front leg was broken. "Did you fall, boy?" Abe asked. The dog looked up into Abe's eyes, wagging his tail. So probably he's going, probably whimpering like that. Poor puppy. Abe patted the gentle dog's head and looked around for something to use to set the leg. He was only 7 years old, but Abe had spent his whole life on a Kentucky farm and knew how to tend to animals. He pared 2 sticks smooth with his pocket knife to make a splint. Then he peeled the soft bark off of a pawpaw bush to wrap around the sticks. Finally, he tied it all around the dog's leg with some rawhide from his belt. So he's fixing him up really good. What a nice boy. And here they're off, setting off to home. By the time Abe was through, the sun was slanting low through the trees. Abe hefted the bag of ground corn back onto his shoulder and called to the dog. The dog struggled up and limped along after Abe on his 3 good legs. Abe was going to be late. That wasn't unusual, but this time he would have a dog to explain. So his parents are probably used to him being late. But I bet they're not used to him bringing a dog home. There's their house. He's heading down there. It's dark outside, the lights on. Abe's father was asleep by the fire when Abe got home, but his mother was waiting up. "Oh, Abraham, where have you been off to this time? Didn't you know I would be worried?" "I found a real honey of a dog. His leg is broken," Abe whispered. "Please let me keep him." Abe looked up at his mother. "He'll do lots of good things for me," he told her. "You just watch and see." I like how he called him. He said, "I found a real honey of a dog." That must mean something like he's a sweet dog, right? Because honey is sweet. Nancy could never say no to her beloved boy, so the dog stayed. Abe snuck Honey scraps of food, and soon the dog was able to walk. Honey's leg looked like a curve in the road, but that didn't stop him from trotting along after Abe on their adventures. I like how the author said that the dog's leg looked like a curve in the road to help us visualize that. Everywhere Abraham went, Honey went. So you can see there's a squirrel up there. There's a little animal here, a little owl or something that he's putting back in the tree. And then this animal was caught in a trap by a hunter, and he's taking off the trap and letting it go. I feel like he must really love animals. One day, Abe showed up late to drop off his grain at the mill. Mr. John shook his head. "Why do you fool your time away?" he asked Abe. "You have seen these hills and hollows hundreds of times. I can't understand what you find to keep you so long on the road." "Well, Mr. John," Abe answered, "Honey got a possum in a hollow stump, and I couldn't get him to leave it. And I couldn't leave Honey." Abe wandered off a bit to wait his turn. He took out a soapstone pencil to practice writing his letters on a bit of bark. But soon the woods were calling, and Abe got the itch to answer. Do you think that the woods are really calling? I think he just can't wait to go try to find some more adventures. Before long, he and Honey found themselves at the mouth of a cave. There's the mouth. Deep, twisting caverns traveled for hundreds of miles under Kentucky. A boy and his dog could get lost in caverns like these, and sure enough, disaster struck. Abe got jammed between two boulders and couldn't move. I think a boulder is like two really big rocks. When it said two boulders, probably two really big rocks. Try as he might, pulling himself this way, that way, and back again, he was hopelessly stuck. Honey whimpered and pawed at the ground. Abe couldn't move. Honey normally never left Abe, but this time he headed alone back into the darkening woods. Honey would need to get help. Oh my goodness. I can see it's probably scary in there. There's bats and there's some eyes. I don't know if you can see the eyes. And I see right here, there's probably a disaster getting ready to happen. What do you think is going to happen right there? I have a guess. Back at the mill, the entire town had gathered in the night to search for Abe. Mr. John had been blowing and blowing on his whistle, but Abe hadn't come. Nancy Lincoln asked Mr. John, "Have you seen the dog, Mr. Hodkin? Was Honey with Abraham when he came to the mill?" "Yes, the dog was with him," answered Mr. John. Abe's mother was grateful for Honey. It comforted her to know Abe had him for protection. She waited anxiously at the edge of the dark forest, hoping her boy would come home. Then she heard something rustling in the bushes. What could it be? Here's Honey, she called. Suddenly, Honey emerged from the bushes, barking and whining at Nancy's feet. The dog looked up into the faces of one another until he got into Mr. John. Then Honey jumped up on Mr. John and barked in his face. "Grab your torches," called Mr. John. "We'll follow where the dog leads." Oh, so they're going to bring their torches. They don't have flashlights, do they? They bring a torch. Yelping and panting, Honey headed back through the woods. The townsfolk followed him, their torches parting the night. So everyone in town is coming with them, looking as Honey leads the way, looking for Abe. When they got to the cave entrance, Honey stopped. The townsfolk were afraid. Many a silent prayer went up for the boy's safety. Mr. John blew 3 times on his cane pole whistle. Oh, look who I see. Uh-oh. That doesn't look good. "Here I am," called Abe, his voice echoing from deep within the cavern. "But I'm fastened." I wonder what fastened means. Maybe stuck? Mr. John carefully made his way into the damp, narrow tunnel. He found Abraham tightly wedged, but had no room to swing a sledge to break the rocks. Mr. John could only tug Abe out, even though it meant leaving some of the boys' hide behind. I wonder what hide is. Can you guess what that means? Gonna leave some of his hide behind? Once Abe was back into the night air, Nancy rushed to hold her beloved son and his precious dog. Abraham was surprised at the crowd. He smiled at his mother. I knew Honey would do great things for me, he said. Now he has paid me back for mending his broken leg. And I guess hide would have been his pants, maybe? Looks like part of his pants are missing. And his knees look all scraped up. The next day, and for many more days after that, Abe and Honey were back at their adventures, bumping and scrambling their way along the banks of Knob Creek. A boy and his loyal dog. I love this book because it has a timeline. We talked about timelines before we left for spring break. Remember? It usually starts when they were born and then carries on throughout their life of all the important things. And I'm not going to read all of these to you now, but a lot of these list all the things he did to help animals. He must have really been an animal lover. And then there's an author's note, which is always fun to read at the back of a biography to find out what's going on or why someone wrote this book. Before he was president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln was a young boy running barefoot through the hills and hollows of Knob Creek, Kentucky. He was born during a fierce winter storm on February 12, 1809, and spent the first years of his life in a one-room log cabin with just one tiny window peeking out onto the wild, untamed world. Can you imagine living in a one-room cabin? Woo! The events of this story are true, as remembered by Abe's childhood best friend, Austin. Back then, before people learned to read and write, they passed on stories orally. They told each other by mouth the stories. Austin enjoyed telling boys and girls the stories about his childhood adventures with Abraham Lincoln. And one of the children that he told the story to grew up to be a journalist who wrote stories down in books. So thankfully, this person who grew up to be a journalist remembered all the stories that Austin told about Abe when they were young. He told many stories, and he really remembered Honey. Abe really remembered Honey. He told one time when Honey saved them both from a wildcat. Ooh, Honey. And at the time when a scraggly stranger with a long scar curving from his eye to his mouth came into town and claimed that Honey was his dog. And his saddest stories was when he watched the Lincolns move to Indiana. So, of course, they probably did not want to say goodbye to each other. They were best friends, or very good friends. Honey wasn't the only animal Abe saved when he lived in Kentucky. He had a tame crow that he and Austin tried to teach to talk, a goat they tried to teach to pull a cart, and a tame raccoon that Honey would bark or would herd back into the yard if it strayed. Abe also released many animals from traps set by his father in the woods, much to his father's dismay. That means father did not like that. When he became president, Abraham Lincoln filled the White House with animals, including a little goat that pulled his son Tad through the halls in a cart. And it says today you can go visit a replica of Abe's childhood cabin nestled next to Knob Creek among the hills and hollows of Hodgenville, Kentucky, where Abe and Honey once roamed free. So if you would like, you can go to Kentucky and see where he lived. And they have a cabin that looks just like the one he grew up in. Another great thing about this book is it has a map on the back, which might be hard for you to see. But here's Abe's house. And here's Austin's house, his friend. And here's the Mr. Hodgens' mill. And down here is the house where Abraham Lincoln was born. So you can see when he was at his house, he had to travel pretty far to get to the mill. And even Austin, they had to travel a little bit there to find each other. So this is a really cool book. Really, really love it. And I hope that you're reading biographies at home this week, because I think that would be awesome. All right. Hope you enjoyed it.